Export of works of art. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And this morning we're joined by Pippa Shirley, Director of Waddesdon Manor and member of the Reviewing Committee for Export of Works of Art and Cultural Objects. A bit of a mouthful, but Pippa, you have been a member of the Reviewing Committee, as we will shorten it, for 7 years, making you one of the longest-serving experts on the Reviewing Committee. And we're so pleased that you're able to join us today to talk about the export of works of art in this country. Not that many of us are necessarily familiar with the export controls we have in the UK for art and heritage objects. So would you like to start by explaining what the Reviewing Committee does?
Yes, of course. And can I just say thank you so much for inviting me to join you on this, because I think it's just a wonderful opportunity to explain a little bit about what the Reviewing Committee does. And I think it's something which isn't necessarily understood by a very wide range of people. And so thank you for the opportunity, because what we do is wonderful, I think.
Great. Well, what do you do?
So the Reviewing Committee exists essentially to protect our cultural heritage and prevent objects which are considered preeminent, so highly important, from going overseas. And so essentially what it does is it provides a kind of a last chance, really, for the UK to hold on to objects which are at risk of being exported. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what we're there to do.
I see. And there's that fabulous phrase, saving for the nation, saving national treasures.
Yes, which is essentially what it's all about. Giving our national institutions an opportunity to acquire objects which would otherwise go abroad.
So this is when the press talk about the minister putting an export stop on and the opportunity to buy. What are the criteria which are used to decide whether something should be subject to a restriction?
There is something called the Waverley Criteria, and the reason that they're called the Waverley Criteria is that they're named after Lord Waverley, who was invited in 1950, in fact, so as long ago as that, to consider and advise on an export policy. Because, I mean, essentially, just to kind of give you a bit of historical background, in the aftermath of the war, when the UK was experiencing great kind of economic austerity and rebuilding and also kind of reassessing its national identity and cultural heritage. And all of these things were kind of facing unprecedented challenges really at that moment. And so Viscount Waverley was invited at that point to consider whether there needed to be any statutory means in place to protect the national heritage. And so a committee was established to review what should be done about this and how to prevent the loss of cultural artefacts overseas. And the remit of that committee was to consider and advise on the policy to be adopted by His Majesty's government in controlling the export of works of art, books, manuscripts, armour and antiquities, and to recommend what arrangements should be made for the practical operation of the policy. So that then led to quite a kind of a long and complicated process to identify exactly, what this should be. And so there were lots of meetings held. There was sort of evidence that was taken from individuals and from relevant bodies. And the report that finally came out of that was published in 1952. And that recommended the establishment of a framework that would allow the government to delay the export of certain works of art, to allow UK institutions a kind of a specific time frame to raise funds to match the overseas. Because there was kind of an understanding even at that stage that what needed to be created was a kind of a level playing field, and that the people who were the vendors essentially needed not to be commercially disadvantaged by an attempt to keep objects in this country.
Yeah, it's sort of striking a balance between the right of ownership and the national interest. But it very broadly, we'll come to the criteria in a moment, national interest in retention, but it doesn't usually operate to make it as a complete ban, but it's putting a pause in so that there's an opportunity for an institution, as it was, to put in a bid to match it. So the owner who's selling gets the money, but it stays in the country. So what are the criteria which were put forward by Waverley?
There were a lot of deliberations of this committee, as you can imagine, centred around, how these decisions should be made. And so they came up with 3 criteria, which are still called the Waverley Criteria. So number 1, is this object so closely connected with our history and national life that its departure would be a misfortune? Waverley 2, is it of outstanding aesthetic importance? And 3, is it of outstanding significance for the study of some particular branch of art, learning, or history? That actually sets up a very broad framework to consider these objects. And I think one of the things which is interesting about having been involved with the committee is that periodically since 1952, there have been questions raised about, are these areas still fit for purpose? And in fact, this was considered informally by Lord Parkinson in 2023, I think it was, a sort of an informal review of whether they were still fit for purpose. And initially he consulted a range of different stakeholders and heritage bodies and so on and so forth. And actually, it was decided that they were still fit for purpose because they can all be interpreted in different ways. And they do cover, in a fairly kind of comprehensive way, anything which might be kind of interesting or important.
Literally anything.
Yes.
That's what I love. From what you've said, Pippa, this fabulous explanation of the Waverley Criteria, that literally describes anything that's important at all. So it's completely up to the committee to say, is this object before us sufficiently important that we think it's a national treasure? And then it will fit within one of them, because there's always going to be some branch of art, learning or history that it's going to relate to, or aesthetic importance.
Exactly. But what sort of underpins all of those is that important thing about that its departure would be a misfortune.
And may I just jump in? Because I'm always interested to go right back to basics, sort of why are things the way they are? It helps me understand in a very basic way. And I love your explanation of the very balanced process and the level playing field and how no party in this export stop process is to be disadvantaged unduly vis-a-vis the others. But what interests me is you just mentioned that this is all to stop, obviously, important objects that have been in this country from going overseas. And I always wonder, well, why are we doing that? Sort of, what is the problem with objects going overseas? What was the mischief that this was designed to prevent?
Well, I think in 1952, there was a kind of a sense, and I think, that feeling is still very much still here, that actually it is important to physically retain important works of art that relate to our cultural heritage in this country. I mean, it means that, the public, the taxpayers, the citizens have much easier access to them if they're in national institutions than they would if they had to go to, the Louvre or the Met or wherever to try and see these objects. There is something that is absolutely vital about retaining the physical objects in the country for which they have such an overriding importance. Now, clearly, the judgment about what that overriding importance is, and indeed whether it is overriding, is one which has to be made. And that just comes back to Lord Waverley's kind of conclusions in the 1950s. And the idea was that there should be a process that was as impartial as possible in making that decision. And so perhaps is this a moment for me to say a little bit about how the committee actually works?
Definitely. Go for it, please. So how does it work?
So how it works is that the whole system is kind of kicked off by a would-be exporter. So somebody who has either acquired or is acting for someone who has acquired an object which they want to take abroad. They apply for a license from the Export Licensing Unit. And at that point, a decision has to be made about whether this is the kind of object which ought to come before the reviewing committee. So there's a network of what are called expert advisors who consider these licenses and work out themselves whether they think there is a question about whether an object should be exported or not. And objects of cultural interest for these purposes are defined as any objects that are manufactured or produced more than 50 years before the date of exportation.
Right. So something that's been in the country for 50 years is potentially at risk of being export stopped if you try and take it out of the country.
Yes, exactly. So the first screening process, if you like, is the expert advisors, who usually are curators and specialists in a whole range of different national institutions. And then if one of those advisors objects to the export, so in other words, they think it is indeed of preeminence and ought to remain in this country, then the application is referred to the reviewing committee for the export of works of art, which is what we're talking about. And it might be interesting for listeners to know that last year, for example, over 5,000 applications were received to export objects, and 37 of those, so only 37, were objected to by expert advisors on the grounds of national importance. So it's actually a very small percentage of the overall number of requests that are being made.
A very high bar. I mean, I think it's particularly brilliant to have you because you have been an expert advisor yourself, haven't you, before you were even a member of the reviewing committee?
Yes, I have. I've been on both sides of the table, as it were. So I have been in that position of kind of considering objects and then writing the cases to put together the evidence for why I've thought that these objects are sort of particularly important. And that is actually quite helpful, I think.
Yeah, gives you a really rich perspective. So in other words, as somebody who is trying to export stuff out of the UK, I put my application into the Export Licensing Unit at Arts Council, and every so often a stack of these will get sent to an expert advisor, someone like you previously, in a museum, who will rifle through the stack and say, these things are all pretty normal. Oh, but wait, this one looks as if it's quite special, and it has been in the country for more than 50 years, so perhaps this ought to go in front of the reviewing committee. Is that more or less it?
Broadly speaking, yes, that's what happens. And so the committee, which kind of considers all of these applications, which was set up following the Waverley recommendations, is composed of 8 people, and it meets monthly to consider the cases which have been referred. And that's where I come in nowadays. So at those meetings, the administration of the meetings is done by the Secretariat, which is actually based in ACE, in Arts Council England, who are operating the system on behalf of the Department of Culture, the DCLS. So these meetings happen every month, and we are given a set of papers for each object which is being considered, and a case will have been made by the expert advisor to keep the object in the country for reasons which they set out. But then, obviously, the one thing we haven't really talked about at the moment is what the rights of the purchaser are in all of this, because they are also able to make a kind of a recommendation for why actually none of this is the case. And in fact, the object could very safely be exported without damaging the national heritage.
So when you say the purchaser, that's assuming the object has been bought by somebody who lives overseas, but actually it could be just anyone. So really, we're talking about the rights then of just whoever it is that's trying to export it.
Yes.
So it could be that I have got a house in America and I want to take my important painting to my house in America.
Yes, absolutely. Or it might be that you're an overseas resident who simply wants to acquire the object and have it wherever you live.
So going back to the level playing field, there are checks and balances to make sure that whoever it is trying to export the object is also, not only do they get to represent themselves, but they have a sort of fair hearing, as it were.
They do have a fair hearing. And the other thing which I think is kind of important in the way in which the hearings run is that the members of the reviewing committee are chosen so that there is a wide range of expertise kind of across that group. And so, for example, there is always a member of the committee who comes from a commercial background. So it's not simply people who may have come through institutions or kind of acquired their academic or their scholarly or curatorial expertise in kind of the public realm. And it also has somebody on it who is a books and manuscripts and archival specialist, because those sorts of objects also can fall within the remit of the committee. But importantly, we're also joined by 3 independent assessors who were chosen specifically for their expertise, which relates to the object which is under consideration. So if, for example, we're considering 3 or 4 cases in a session, then we may see as many as 12 or different expert advisors, because each object will have advisors who are selected specifically because of their expertise in that particular field. And so that means that alongside the kind of the homegrown, as it were, expertise of the committee, it means that we have very sort of specific advice immediately on hand, which is invaluable.
Yeah, so you're hearing from the applicants team who will be professionals and will have expert advice. I mean, you're hearing from the expert advisor who essentially has called the item in. The reviewing committee's got its expertise, and you've got the independent advisors there for the reviewing committee. And these hearings, how do they run?
I mean, in some ways, it feels a little bit like a sort of a court hearing about them, because our chair is leading KC, Andrew Hockhauser. So he runs each hearing. And at the beginning, the committee is in the room and the expert advisor and the applicant are both invited in. And then we have our 3 independent assessors, and we all sit round at the kind of the big table. And then the chairman will run through a series of quite kind of formulaic questions about, who owns the object, they have the rights to the object, various other kind of questions about value and other things. And then we've all been sent the papers beforehand and we're all expected to have read them and so forth. And then he opens up the floor to questions. So he invites both the expert advisor and the applicant to make any further submissions, which they may not have said in the papers which they've put before the committee. They can amplify points, they can add things, at that stage. And then we open the floor to questions. So both the independent assessors and the committee are invited to ask both the applicant and the expert advisor questions about the information that they put forward. And those questions can sometimes be pretty sort of searching. If there are aspects which either we feel haven't been fully covered, or things which have been overlooked, or additional information which we think might be of interest in the case, then we can try and tease all of that out. And actually, one of the many marvellous things about being involved in the committee is that you learn so much, actually, because you have a room chock full of experts.
Chock full is right. I mean, you're describing the process. I've never heard of so many experts all gathered under one roof. So it sounds like a very informal kind of court hearing.
It is. But I think the good thing about it is that it's very balanced. So everybody gets a chance to speak. Everyone gets a chance to put their views across. I mean, one of the things which is always quite interesting about it is that for objects which might have been acquired through the sale rooms, for example, part of the information which is made available to us, the kind of the evidence might be the lot essay which has gone along with it when the object has appeared for sale. And then, so sometimes, have a lot essay which says, this is the most extraordinary and magnificent and important object. And then, you have the applicant saying, oh, actually, there are, 6 of these elsewhere. And
that's a total classic. Having been myself on all sides of this, having worked at an auction house for many years and seen the work that goes into writing those essays about how it's absolutely the most unique and brilliant and wonderful object, and you must pay millions of pounds for it. When it does get bought for millions of pounds by somebody who lives overseas, and then it gets inevitably export stopped, there's a sort of groan that goes up, because you're going to have to go before the reviewing committee. You will have seen this essay saying how brilliant it is, and exactly as you say, Pippa, have to explain that actually there's nothing special about this really. It can absolutely leave these shores and no one will miss it.
Yes, there are lots and lots of occasions when, in fact, the applicant will not produce a challenge, will say, yes, we agree with you.
Bang to rights.
And so then you're almost kind of going into the meeting with an expectation that a deferral will be given. Because I think that's the other thing that you need to remember, that what this is creating is an opportunity for a national institution to match the price, which is a fair price. And if an object has been through the sale rooms, then it is a fair market price because the market has proved itself. It's not designed to act as a full and final barrier to the kind of the flow of works of art overseas.
So that's really interesting. So if somebody who's trying to export something goes into the reviewing committee and says, look, fair enough, we think it does meet the Waverley criteria, there's no question about it, this thing is really important, then what happens?
Well, we go through the process. So it might be that in their documents, they've actually, because there's inevitable forms which are kind of filled out for all of this stuff, there's a kind of a place on the form in which the applicant can say, we challenge what the expert advisor has said about whether this object is Waverley 1, 2 or 3, or all 3 of them, on the following grounds. And quite often that place on the form can be just left blank because there is essentially no challenge. But it still has to be properly debated. And often in the discussion, there will be some very valid reasons about why we have to think very carefully about this particular object, and is it indeed so important to national heritage that its departure should be prevented if possible. So although there are some cases which might seem very cut and dried, actually it's incredibly important that you do go through the process, you hear the arguments, and then you take the decision, because things may emerge in the course of the hearing that either people weren't aware of, or there can be a kind of a change in emphasis. It's also very interesting that as far as the object itself is concerned, a very important part of the process is that the object itself is seen, and is seen by the committee.
I have on many occasions absolutely had my head in my hands trying to get objects to the reviewing committee, which are as big as a house, absolutely impossible. But as you say, Pip, of course, it's vital. How can you really choose whether something is important or not unless you've clapped eyes on it?
It is vital. And actually, that was something which has in fact changed as a result of COVID, because we did in fact keep, although volume of cases was much reduced, we did actually keep the reviewing committee running through the pandemic, but on the basis that clearly we were not going to be able to physically see the object. So it was done on the basis of very good quality images. But after the pandemic, and in fact, it was one of the changes to the procedure, it was decided, it was stipulated, in fact, that as a member of the committee, you are not allowed to vote, because what happens following the deliberations that have taken place at the committee, a vote is taken by the members of the committee and by the independent assessors on whether the 3 Waverley criteria are met or not. But actually, you are not allowed to participate in that process. In other words, participate in the hearing in a material sense, unless you have physically seen the object. It is astonishing how your view and your understanding of a work of art can change when it's actually in front of you, as opposed to the most extraordinarily detailed and high-resolution image which you might have had otherwise.
Yeah, it's very different having an object, a physical object in your hands or right in front of you. And the whole thing is so subjective anyway. It certainly sounds so to me, because it's just a small group of human beings gathering around and deciding whether something is really important enough to be a national treasure. That's just a matter of their opinion, right?
Yes, and the interpretation of the Waverley criteria does inevitably have a degree of subjectivity in it. But I think that's partly why so many people are involved, because then you balance all of those different opinions, and often very varying opinions, throughout the committee and the expert advisors. That's another of the things which is actually very interesting about the process.
But actually, and what's brilliant is that this process of choosing whether something is going to meet the Waverley criteria or not, say it does, that's when the real test happens, isn't it, Pippa? Because then that's where the more objective test, I suppose, of whether it's going to be, in fact, money is going to be found and whether it's actually going to be acquired. And I'm probably getting massively ahead of myself, because we've got many questions which are jostling for position. And this is probably coming right down the line. But when I said it's a very subjective process, it's not that subjective really in the end, I suppose, because if you are on the side of generously saying that things are important, then they've still got to pass the very major hurdle of an institution coming forward that's going to be able to actually fundraise to acquire the object.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So having had this sort of quasi-legal hearing, the expert advisor and the applicant are then invited to withdraw by the chairman, and then the debate happens in camera, as it were, about whether the object fits any of the Waverley criteria. And we should say that it only needs to hit 1 in order for a deferral to take place. So assuming that we have all agreed that it's Waverley for whichever reason, then there's a discussion about what the deferral period should be, whether it's 3 months, 6 months or longer. And there's an initial deferral period which allows a serious expression of interest to be found. And it will fall to the expert advisor to act as a champion for that object. So in other words, assuming that the deferral has been decided upon, the expert advisor then has to go out to all of the national institutions to try and find a home for this object and for the funds to create the matching offer.
I was just thinking that it was cool enough being known as an expert advisor. I would absolutely retire on that. But then to be known as a champion as well really is epic.
Yes. And obviously, the expert advisors who are appearing in front of the committee know that if their case has sort of done what they want it to do and it has been agreed to be Waverley, then the next thing is going to be, OK, so will you help to find a home for it? And that's actually quite a big and complicated piece of work. I mean, I think the other thing that we probably ought to say is that everyone who sits on this committee and the expert advisors and the applicants are all doing it on a voluntary basis. They give their time for this. And it's quite a big commitment for the members of the panel, because we obviously have to get our heads around all these different kinds of objects and be sure that we're as over the information that's provided as we possibly can be. But it's a really, really big ask, both for the applicants and for the expert advisors, because as part of their day job, they have to research these cases, write them, present them, and then, if successful, act as a champion in an environment which is extremely difficult, as we all know, in terms of getting together often very large amounts of money to ensure that an object can stay in the country. So that, in a way, the work of the committee is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and then everything else is not quite so visible, but is going on underneath.
Yeah. My sense of, I was involved in the review about 20 years ago by Matthew Farrer, was that the work of the reviewing committee was seen then as being very private. The hearings, I think, still are private, but things would sort of feed through to the minister. But now, not only do we have the annual reports of the reviewing committee, which are a very good read because they go into the objects which have been subject to the stops and so on, but quite a bit of the actual case papers are published, including a summary of the committee's discussions, what the vote was on the individual criteria, and reading one where, in fact, on one of the criteria, the committee split 4-4 and the chair had to exercise a second vote. on it. So there's a lot more sunlight into the process now, I think.
Yes, and I think that's very important. I mean, the actual kind of proceedings of the committee have to be confidential because clearly there are commercial and personal interests at stake. But thereafter, it's immensely important that the process and the outcome is as transparent as possible, because all of this is being conducted in the national interest. So obviously it's very important that, the nation can be aware of what's going on.
And is there national money at stake? I mean, then that's when we really need to know. I mean, how does that work? Is the taxpayer paying for anything here?
So what happens in a kind of a funding campaign is that whichever national institution has sort of said, yes, we're going to make a serious expression of interest in this object. We want to try and put the fundraising together to secure it. So they will use initially their own resources, their own internal resources. So those, I suppose you could say, are taxpayer funded for the national collections. But as we all know, their internal resources are very limited. So then it's a matter of going out to the funding bodies and asking for support for the acquisition. So once the hearing is over, then a recommendation is made to the Secretary of State. And I think this is another important point about the workings of the committee, because all we are there to do is to decide whether an object is Waverley or not. The decision about whether a licence is deferred is taken by the Secretary of State. And so in the aftermath of the hearing, the Secretary of State is advised that this is the conclusion. And generally speaking, the advice of the committee will be accepted, together with a recommendation about how long the deferral periods should be. And then the export licence is deferred for that period of time while the expert advisor tries to find an institution which is interested, which elicits a serious expression of interest and a fundraising campaign. But we're often, in the committee, we're often issues about, so perhaps provenance, for example, or valuation of the object kind of might come up. But we just have to keep coming back to the fact that the only thing we are there to deliberate upon are the Waverley Criteria.
So what sort of items have been saved for the nation recently, particularly good ones?
Well, there's a huge variety of things which come before us. And I think that we only think about beautiful paintings or sculpture or occasionally kind of pieces of furniture. But we've had a huge range of different sorts of objects over the years. One which sticks in my mind is a sledge and flag, which were taken by Ernest Shackleton on his Nimrod expedition to the South Pole. Not surprisingly, that was deemed to be Waverley 1 because it was of such importance to our national story. And we do obviously see extraordinarily beautiful and important all sorts of other works of art, but there is just an immense range of things that we do consider. Recently, for example, we've had some incredibly important archival material that related to Alan Turing. So his notebooks and his research papers for the Delilah project, which was a research project that he undertook in the aftermath, in fact, of Enigma. Enigma is very much more famous than Delilah, but Delilah was about trying to come up with a portable encryption device that could be used for surveillance and so on. And so that one was a really kind of interesting case. We have all sorts of ancient material, Anglo-Saxon brooches, for example. We've had the most beautiful little sampler, which was made by a child, which is one of the earliest of depictions in that medium of the Menai Bridge. And I think one of the other things which I always sort of find fascinating is the way in which we sort of approach the Waverley Criteria has kind of changed over the years, because I think it's probably fair to say that we're applying Waverley now to objects which perhaps 20 years ago would not have been deemed to be of such national importance. But that's very much to do with the way that we reflect where the national psyche sits on these things.
So what sort of examples would now be covered by Waverley which wouldn't have been?
The sampler of the Menai Bridge, I think, is a very good one because in lots of ways it's a very, to say it's a humble object is not quite the right word to use, but it was a sort of a vernacular object in lots of respects, sort of made by a child, something that was not, in terms of lots of the ways that you could approach this, of outstanding kind of beauty, but yet it had a very important regional and local importance and importance to local community. And that's something which is becoming more and more important, I think, in our deliberations. What does national interest mean? Which bit of the nation are we talking about? How important might it be to a very specific element of that community? It was a reflection of our kind of industrial heritage, because the bridge was obviously considered almost a sort of a wonder of certainly a wonder of the local world at the time as a structure. It reflected the way in which trade and industry was kind of developed in the 19th century. There were all sorts of different aspects of what it represented, which were very clearly, very deeply embedded in the national identity.
What sort of things are not saved for the nation that you might hope would be? Maybe things which have been found to meet the Waverley criteria, but then haven't been able to be saved by the nation for whatever reason.
I mean, there, essentially what we're doing, I think, is coming back to the question of the ease or not of raising the required funds, aren't we?
Yes, it's all about money, yeah.
I think it quite largely is about money and about the difficulties, really, of raising often considerable amounts of money, many millions of pounds, in an environment which is becoming increasingly challenging. And I think that's one of the things which, going forward, government really needs to think quite hard about, because it does potentially calls the whole process into question if actually you can say, yes, this object should absolutely stay in this country, but in fact, no one's in a position to raise the money to follow through. And that is a real issue. And it's something which there's quite a lot of kind of lobbying going on about at the moment, because, national institutions have to balance their priorities, and they will probably agree that an object ought to be able to be retained.
But they might not have the funds or the means or the space.
They just might not have bandwidth or the space or anything else to do anything about it. And that's one of the difficulties which the expert advisors as champions often encounter, is that institutions will just say, I'm terribly sorry, we'd absolutely love to, but we can't. We just can't.
And is there any particular object that has caused you particular chagrin or the powers that be sadness that it hasn't been possible to save?
Every object which disappears causes that kind of sadness. The things that we are able to save, though, conversely, are immensely exciting and joyous. So that's what we hang on to.
We talk about the original work by Waverley is now 75 years old. It's just the way in which the criteria still seem to be up to date. One of the relatively few changes was the introduction of Ridley purchasers. So Nicholas Ridley, who was a sort of a free marketeer but very heavy smoking member of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, I think said his sort of government decision making was no in tray, no out tray, just an ashtray. Introduced the Ridley criteria to allow non-institutional bidders. Has that really functioned much? Has that been used?
Yes, it has. I mean, interestingly, we just use the term private purchaser. And there have been various occasions in the past when that's been used. And I think the question then is essentially about access, because the object needs to be in the public domain. But if a private purchaser is willing to then place an object in the private domain, following the conditions which are required, then that's a wonderful thing.
At first blush, it seems really unfair that some individual, say I live overseas and I buy at auction in London an object that my heart is just set on and I love it and I buy it, I want to export it to my place, but I can't because some other just individual, some other person, we're not talking about the National Gallery here, just some person pops up and says, no, I'm going to save that for the nation so you can't have it. But you're saying that actually it is a balanced process, because the person who has popped up in the UK to save the object for the nation, what do they do to give public access?
Well, they have to either put it on loan to kind of a national institution or to a museum or to a heritage body which has public access. So in a nutshell, that's it.
So they don't get to keep it. It's not that unfair. They have to provide public access. I mean, I think it's really important.
Yes.
Very good.
So, I mean, that's another kind of, good way of securing a good kind of public outcome. Another way in which the process is kind of responding to circumstances and to need is that we're increasingly seeing institutions working together. So making a joint acquisition and then the object goes on display. It spends a certain amount of time in display in one place and then kind of moves to the other. So a good example of that was the acquisition of a painting of The Young Teacher by Rebecca Solomon, which was a couple of years ago, I think it was last year, which was jointly acquired by the Museum of the Home in London and Tate, because, they both saw the value in the painting and they were both kind of interested in it. And together they were able to put together enough to create the matching offer.
One of the other areas that's come up in relatively recent is the position of binding offers, because, as you said, if a stop's put in place, institution may then seek to raise the funds to acquire. As the system was originally set up, the owner, the exporter, wouldn't actually be obliged to accept the offer. Although I think the principle was if they said no, then they just weren't going to be given a license. They weren't going to be allowed to export it. But firstly, how real a problem is that? And secondly, how's that being addressed?
I mean, it is a problem. There have been occasions when the deferral system was deemed to have failed because of exactly that occurrence. And so the government sought some independent advice on what to do about this kind of thing. The intention really is to avoid wasted fundraising efforts because we've already talked a bit about how much work is involved in all of this. And so if a museum puts together everything it needs to do to create the matching offer, but then the purchaser kind of declines to accept that offer, then clearly that's not good on almost any level. So that was why the legally binding offers process was introduced, so that once an offer has been made, it must be accepted. And that does seem to be working much better.
So I suppose that brings us to a question about the reviewing committee and what its kind of remit is and what its limitations are, because there is presumably a limit to what you can do to keep things in this country. So what would you say about that, Pippa?
Well, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the limitations, I think, are very largely to do with funding and the availability of that within the system. But otherwise, I mean, it does seem to be, and I think to a number of other stakeholders, that actually the system is working really pretty well and continues to work well.
I must say that I think, as an observer, it's an incredibly balanced and beautiful system because there is that leeway to really consider the individual aspects of each case. But I'm thinking specifically about things that the committee's not really allowed to consider. The committee, as you've explained very clearly, only considers the Waverley Criteria, and even then only makes a recommendation to the minister. So that's quite a delineated remit. But what about the must-be cases that come up all the time, where actually there are sort of special circumstances? What about, for example, if an object is going to what you might say is its spiritual home, and that spiritual home happens to be overseas, but without question, it is of outstanding aesthetic importance and it's been in this country for 50 years. So, it's slam dunk meets the Waverley Criteria. What do you do about that?
Yes. So if it meets the Waverley Criteria, it meets the Waverley Criteria. I mean, in a sense, that's our job done, as it were. We're not allowed to take any of those other considerations on board. But I think this is actually where the fact that it's a recommendation which is made to the minister becomes extremely important, because there are mechanisms whereby further representations can be made to the minister, either by the applicant or indeed by the expert advisor, about exactly that kind of occurrence. And it might be then that the minister would take those further representations into account in making their decision about whether the licence is deferred or not.
So you'd say to the minister, look, there's no doubt this is Waverley 2 or Waverley whatever, but actually the place where it's going, the place that has bought this object, really it's where it absolutely belongs. And over to you. And then the minister might say, we're not going to place an export deferral.
We would not say that, because all we can advise him or her about is the Waverley issue. And sometimes the minister may then come back to the committee to say, well, the prospective purchaser or whoever has come to say, actually, this really ought to be allowed to go through. And then we can make a kind of a response on that basis.
So the representations don't come from you.
But the fact that it is a recommendation rather than an instruction, as it were, is very important in that regard.
And it's a sort of a particularly limited role. You've got the criteria. If you do, though, see a bit of a flag on provenance on ownership, if there's a, say, Holocaust spoliation issue that just seems to be coming out of your investigations, is that something which the committee will comment on, or say to Arts Council England, you need to look at that, or just essentially leave that to the export advisor and the applicant and so on to pursue those topics?
Yes. So the expert advisor would, in deciding whether to actually put the object forward to the committee, would be the first sift, as it were, on those sorts of issues. And there's obviously quite a long process which has gone through before the case actually arrives. And there, the Secretariat ACE can come into play, because if there are things which they feel are either need further exploration or are raising questions for whatever reason, then those kinds of things can be raised before the hearing. If anything comes out as a result of the hearing or afterwards, then again, there are mechanisms in place to identify whether they are actually issues or not. But our role in the committee is not to consider those particular aspects.
So, Pippa, I mean, there are 1,000 other questions that we could ask you, but I feel that this has been such an interesting discussion, and I just would love to know, have you got a favourite? I know it's awful to ask, have you got a favourite? But is there a particular object, or more than one, that have particularly brought you joy in your time helping to save national treasures?
They all bring joy because you learn so much about them, and it's kind of expanded my universe being on this committee. And I think everyone who has been on the committee would say the same thing. And we all feel that we're doing something which is immensely important. But there are some objects which kind of do particularly resonate. One which I think always comes back to me is the wonderful anthropomorphic crab, which was made in Staffordshire by the Martin brothers, which is unquestionably one of the ugliest things I have ever seen.
Oh, it is so ugly. Why does it bring you joy, and why was it export stopped?
Well, because it actually, interestingly enough, I think it hit 2 of the Waverley criteria, one of which was Waverley 2, which was the aesthetic importance.
Oh, wow.
Because it doesn't say in that criteria that it has to be aesthetically important, but it was just one of those, I mean, it was an object which had an intense personality. And I think one of the things which has been marvellous about that is that it's had such a life. Because, I mean, one of the things which we're very interested in as a committee and that the process really kind of focuses on is the way in which these objects can then kind of add value. You know, they need to be able to work, whether kind of, you know, educationally or culturally or in terms of display or exhibition or advancement of scholarship. And in the case of that object, which ended up with the box in Plymouth, it's had the most fantastic education and learning programme and community programme kind of constructed around it. So it's become a kind of an iconic object in a way, which is marvellous.
I think that is actually the most perfect national treasure, really, because why not? It's humorous and it's characterful and it, as you say, it's important for education. We all frankly love that crowd. I really urge anyone listening to get on the internet and Google the anthropomorphic crab, and you will see exactly what we're talking about. That's extremely funny. And Pip, I love that that's the object that you choose that brings you joy.
And the Martin brothers, you know, were radical potters. They were absolutely out on their own.
Well, on that note, what a delight it's been to talk to you and to hear from you about the work of the Reviewing Committee. It's a really fascinating world, Pippa, and we are honoured to have had you to explain it to us. So thank you so much.
It's been really fun and lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.